Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November Consulting webinar. My name is Michael Mathis. I am the Solutions Director here at CDI, and today's topic is My Workflow House Needs Tidying, How to Organize Your Workflows. If you have any questions during the webinar or need help, please post questions in the questions box at any time. We do have staff monitoring questions, and we will have time available at the end of today's webinar to go over any other questions that you may have. Some tips for success for today's webinar. Be sure to take notes and screenshots. I like to notate how far into the webinar we are so that I can easily find that same spot again in the recording after the webinar completes. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We love all of your questions, and any questions do help everyone. Please complete the survey that will be sent out after today's webinar. We love hearing all of your feedback and your ideas for future webinar content. And also remember that this webinar will be recorded and available on the CDI YouTube page within a few days of today's webinar. My workflow house needs tidying. How to organize your workflows. The intended audience for today's webinar are Laserfiche power users and Laserfiche administrators. If you are neither a power user nor an administrator, please do stay in today's webinar as there will be plenty of valuable information for everyone. And today's webinar is going to be applicable to Laserfiche self-hosted environments. Today's agenda for the webinar, we're going to learn how to categorize, organize, and name our workflows. We're going to learn how to identify and remove unused workflows. We can secure our workflow system with permissions and rights. And finally, we'll take a look at some system maintenance in order to keep our database log size as small as we can. We all need some help from time to time with organization. It's always an ongoing task, and professional organizer is now a career. Not everyone is able to keep everything maintained and clean all by themselves. It will be a team effort. And a lot of times, finding the right tool for the job is the first task in order to really start organizing, whether it's your workflow system or your house, your Laserfiche repository, anything. So we will review some general steps for organization today, and we will also look into tools that are helpful along each step of the way. Our first step to organization is going to be to evaluate our system. What needs to be cleaned up? What is the extent of our project? Are we going to be looking only at our workflows that we have published? Are we going to be evaluating the entire system, including the external objects that are referenced, such as web services and workflow databases? Next, we will organize everything. We'll clean up our workflows and rename them. We will organize them into folders to make everything easier to find. Our third step is going to be to purge. So we'll delete all of our unused items. We can remove specific versions of workflows, or we can remove workflows entirely. And our last step is going to be to maintain our system. So we'll learn how to do some preventative maintenance, such as assigning permissions, as well as ongoing maintenance, such as reviewing the system and making sure all of our data governance is being followed. So step one, we're going to evaluate our system. Let's define the scope of our project. Are we going to be looking at just our workflows? Are we going to be looking at workflows as well as our external objects and getting those cleaned up? what's being used, what's not used, is it broken, does it bring you joy? We have a couple of tools available for evaluating all of our workflows. The first tool available that we'll go over is the Workflow Statistics Report, and this is available in both the Workflow Designer as well as the Workflow Administration Console. Typically, I do like running the report from the Workflow Designer, as it has a couple of extra options such as charts and exporting. In the Workflow Administration Console, we are able to view all of our external objects, so any file attachments, email servers, data sources, web services, etc., that are added into our workflow system. The Workflow Statistics Report is going to allow us to view report information on all of our workflows, or we can filter by specific criteria, such as the start time of the workflow or the time of the last action. When we run our report, it will give us a table of information that shows the workflow name, the total number of instances that have run, the number of currently running instances, the number of completed and terminated instances, as well as some time statistics on average time, minimum, and maximum time for the workflows to run. After we run our report, we're able to view a chart of the information from the report, or we could also export the report to a CSV file for us to use later. In the Workflow Administration Console, we are able to view all of our external objects. So here we are going to be looking at data sources today. From our data source or any other external object, we're able to view the linked workflows. So we can see where this specific data source, for example, is being used. We're able to test our web service connections and our database connections to make sure that they are still functional and working. And we're also able to configure or remove these data sources as needed. So if we wanted to rename or we needed to change our connection string, we could do so here. After we're done evaluating our system, our next step is going to be to organize. Do we have any standardized naming conventions? Do our workflows and activities follow these naming conventions? Do our external objects follow the naming conventions? Naming conventions are going to be very important to help sort and organize everything. Everything within the Workflow Designer is going to be sorted alphabetically. And in the Workflow Administration Console, you're also able to sort things alphabetically or by other columns available. By having a clear and concise naming convention, it's going to be a lot easier to see what workflows or what external objects pertain to what, rather than having everything all mixed together. So for sorting and categorizing our workflows, a lot of times I recommend using prefixes for naming conventions. This is going to help categorize and sort your workflows appropriately. I typically see either a department prefix, so IT hyphen, HR hyphen, sales hyphen, or it could be more of a functional prefix. So for example, we have a lot of workflows that interact with our CRM. So we prefix those with CRM because they are for maintaining integrations between Laserfiche and our CRM. We can also organize our workflows into folders within the Laserfiche Workflow Designer, and that will help us group those related workflows together even if they cross departments or cross functionality. The Workflow Designer is going to be our primary tool available for organizing our workflows. Within the Workflow Designer, we have the ability to reassign our referenced objects. This is a very handy tool for housekeeping and maintenance. We can reassign all of those data connections at once throughout the entire workflow instead of going activity by activity. And within the Laserfiche Workflow Rule Manager, you're also able to organize workflows into folders. Our first step for organization is going to be renaming our workflows and activities. So here we have a very messy workflow. I have no clue what it does other than file employee docs. I don't know what department this is for. I can't tell what anything is doing other than branching and assigning token values. If we follow our naming conventions and clean up our workflow, here we have our workflow name prefixed with HR, because this is for our human resources department, and this is the employee autofile workflow. Our token activities have been renamed with a prefix of assigned document name, and each of those has a description of what we're actually assigning that document name with. So we have with our description, with no description, with a type and description, or a type and no description. And all of our branches are named as well. We can easily see what each branch is going to do without needing to dig in further and review all of our conditional decisions one by one. Within our workflow, we also can update all of our referenced objects at one time. If you have a very large workflow with a lot of data sources referenced, we're pushing and pulling data all over in this workflow to populate documents, build mail merges, who knows. By clicking on our gear icon to view the advanced properties in Laserfiche Workflow, we can manage our referenced objects, and from here we can easily select, for example, our HR LF external tables and reassign that referenced object to a different object. This will then update all of those workflow activities at once for you instead of needing to go through one by one. Within the Laserfiche Workflow Rule Manager, organizing your workflows into folders is going to help categorize everything and organize them logically, even if some things are going to be crossing departments or crossing process boundaries. Folders are going to be available to all users. If I create this HR processes folder and organize my workflows into this folder, every other workflow user will see these same folders with the same folder contents. Step 3 in our organization process is going to be to purge. It no longer brings us joy. We can get rid of it. We can delete our workflows and specific workflow versions. Deleting workflow versions is very helpful for removing external objects. So a lot of times we will have an external object that was referenced in an old version of a workflow. We no longer use that object. We want to get rid of it. By deleting that specific workflow version, we're able to delete that external object without deleting our entire workflow. And a part of every good purge is to make sure we have a backup. Back up your SQL database And from within the workflow administration console and the workflow designer, we are able to export our workflows as well as export specific versions of workflows. Within the workflow administration console, if we select our workflow definitions, this will display all of our workflows that we have available in our system. From here, we're able to export and delete specific versions of workflows. And we can delete our external objects as well within the workflow administration console. To delete a specific workflow version or view information about previous versions of workflows, we can view our version history within the workflow administration console. This will open up our version history dialog where we can see when it was last updated. We have the ability to delete that specific version of the workflow. And we also have the ability to download that specific version of the workflow so that we have it as a backup if needed. Or another time this comes in very handy outside of the realm of organization is if you need to roll back, you can always go into the workflow administration console, export your prior version, and reopen that one. With external objects, so these are going to be data sources, web services, email servers, etc. We have the ability to delete individual external objects from our system. However, if we are using that object in a previous version of our workflow, as I had mentioned, we're going to have a bad time. We'll see the error message, the object cannot be deleted because it is linked to a published workflow. We have the ability to then view our linked workflows, which will then show us exactly which workflow versions are referencing this object. We could delete those workflow versions and then come back and our no longer used external object is then able to be deleted. Our last step in organization is going to be to maintain our system. We put in a lot of work to get everything cleaned up. We want it to stay pretty. So we're going to be doing ongoing maintenance of our system. We'll be conducting regular reviews, ensuring that our data governance plan is followed, workflows rather, external objects are all named correctly. And in order to help with this ongoing maintenance, we'll look at a couple of preventative maintenance options. So we can restrict permissions, either globally within workflow or to specific workflows or external objects. And we'll also take a look at some advanced configuration options. Both of these tools are going to be available in the Workflow Administration console. Under permissions and rights, we have the ability to configure permissions and rights per user, per workflow, per object. And under the advanced server options, this is where we're going to be able to configure various options for database maintenance, reporting maintenance, making sure we're not logging more information in that database than we want to help keep our workflow database smaller. Workflow security allows us to control access to individual workflows or external objects. So for example, we have our everyone user selected. We can configure the workflow rights for that user, attachment rights, data source rights, and we can also configure our general permissions. So we could say this individual user has permissions to create workflows and search workflows, but that's it. We're not going to allow them to delete. We're not going to allow modifying settings. That's a big one to restrict for kind of your day-to-day power users rather than your system administrators. So this, by not allowing modify settings, users are not allowed to configure external objects such as email servers, database servers, everything we had discussed already. And those users are also not going to be able to modify other settings within workflow, so configuring repositories, configuring advanced server options, etc. The Laserfiche workflow database can fill quickly. A lot of reporting information is stored into the database, and that information is used for reports that we've discussed already, as well as other information. So we can configure the reporting and instance lifetime for our workflow server. The reporting data is going to be what's used for the workflow statistics report. All of those other reporting features that we will take a look at. The instance data is going to be more the track tokens and conditional logging, all of that extra workflow instance information that workflow is going to track. We can also control that tracking information under the workflow tab, either globally or per specific workflow. So if we are tracking a lot of tokens and we don't need that information all the time, but if something has gone wrong, we want to turn that back on to do some advanced diagnosis, we can configure that here. At this point, we will move into our live demonstration. And to get started, I'm going to open up my Laserfiche Workflow Designer. And if anyone does have questions, please post them in the questions box at any time. So to get started, I have my Laserfiche Workflow Designer open. And the first thing that we are going to take a look at are the available reporting options. From our workflow menu, we can create our workflow statistics report. And this is the report that's going to give us all of the information, such as how many instances have ran, how many have completed successfully, etc. So here we can run our report for all of the information. And we can see all of the 31 workflows that have run in the reporting window for the workflow database. By default, that's going to be 1 year. We have a lot of information here. We could view this in our chart by selecting everything. We can select a couple key workflows. So if we grab our HR workflows, right-click on our rows and select View Chart. This will allow us to view the information from our table in a chart. So for example, instances started over time. We can see how many instances of each workflow were started over the past year. This is a lot of information and isn't as fun to look at with the teeny tiny icons. So I'm going to create a new statistics report. And this time I want to filter this to the time of last action is going to be within the last 2 months. We'll take a look at a shorter range of data. And here we can see everything that ran within the last 2 months. If we right-click, view our chart again, that's going to give us just the last 2 months rather than the full year. If we want to look at a specific workflow, So if we were interested in that same information specifically for our HR employee review workflow, for example, we can click our Run Report link, and that will run the report for that specific workflow, which hasn't been used. Let's do the same for AutoFile. Here we go. So here we can see we had 36 total instances, 36 of those completed, and on average, we take about 3/4 of a second to run this workflow. We right-click to view our chart. We can see here how many workflow instances have run per day. Having just the one workflow makes the chart a little bit easier to look at. If we hover over each individual item in our chart here, we can see on, for example, April 26th, we had 4 instances of our HR employee AutoFile workflows started. If we wanted to export our information, we can right-click on our report results and choose Export from our menu. And here we can save our exported file as a CSV file to have that information available for whatever is needed. If we were to next take a look in the Workflow Administration console, let's take a look at the external objects that we have created in our system. Today we'll focus mainly on our data sources, but this information is applicable to really every other type of external object as well. So here we take a quick look through our list items. We can see there's really no naming convention. We have a little bit with HR and Gov, however, not much of a naming convention at all. And I see we have CDHR as well as HR external tables. If we go to our Manage Data Sources, here we're able to test our data source. Ooh, bad data, that's no good. So our CDHR data source is broken. Let's test our HR external tables. And here we see that that one is working. So part of our cleanup is going to be to remove our CDHR data source because it's no longer needed. If we try to just remove our data source and say, okay, we're having a bad time. It cannot be deleted because it's linked to a published workflow. We can use our View Linked Workflows item here to view, let's look at our HR database. Good tip, again, remember to make backups. That way, if you're selecting your good data source instead of your bad data source to delete, you can undo with that backup. So here in our invalid data source, if we view our linked workflows, we can see this is in our HR employee review workflow in version 8, as well as version 1. So let's go back to our workflow designer. And I'm going to close all of my other tabs. And we'll take a look at our HR employee review workflow. So this is the workflow that is using that external object. If we validate our workflow, you see here we have our 3 instances of the insert, update, or query activity. that are referencing this database, and we're getting our bad data error. 3 activities really isn't that many, but if it was, say, 30 activities, that would take a long time to go through one by one. So what we can do instead is by clicking on any white space in the background of our workflow, we can view additional properties about our workflow. Here we're able to select our referenced object, so we'll look at our data sources. And if we click on Manage Reference Objects, this will allow us to reassign our CDHR database to our HRLF external tables database. We can choose to reassign all of our references, or we can kind of pick and choose which ones we are reassigning. We choose to reassign all, click OK. You see here CDHR now has 0 references and 3 references to the HRLF external tables database. At this point, we can publish our workflow. And we are no longer using that CDHR data source. If we go back to our workflow admin console, and again, we will try to delete this and say yes, we're still going to have a bad time because it's still linked in those previous versions of our workflow. So even though it's not used in any of our current versions, it's still referenced in those old versions. So we can see here again, HR Employee Review version 1 and version 8. If we go under our workflows folder and select our workflow definitions, we can then find our HR Employee Review workflow in our list. And let's take a look at our linked objects here. This is going to show us all of the linked objects, so all of our external object references that are being used by any version of our workflow. This will allow us to easily see what's being used in each version of each workflow. So for example, we have our attachment for employee review summary, our data source for our HRLF external tables, and a web service reference to forms. Here we can view our version history of our workflow, and we can pick and choose which versions we want to delete or download. So here, before I delete version 8, if I wanted to download a copy of this, just in case I need it again for reference or anything, I can do so, and that will export our workflow as a WFX workflow designer file. That file is then able to be opened within the workflow designer, just like any other published workflow. So here, now that we have a backup, we are going to delete our 2 versions of our workflow and say, yes, we want to delete all 2 versions. And we can close our dialog. We go back to our data sources. Let's take a look again at our linked workflows. And here we have everything cleaned up. So we are able to delete this broken, unused data source once and for all. If we go back to the workflow designer, once we have workflows that are cleaned up, we can start organizing these into folders. I accidentally missed that step in my notes. So to create a new folder, we can right-click anywhere in the white space in our folder list and select Add New Folder. So let's call this folder HR Processes. And in all of our workflows, we can either one by one drag and drop into our folder, or if we right-click on our folder, we can select Add Workflows. And this will bring up a dialog showing all of our workflows we have available. Since we named all of these with our HR prefix, it's easy to find all of our HR workflows at once, select them all, and add them to our folder. If the workflow already exists in the folder, it'll give you a message, but that's okay. We only need it in there once. We're also able to add subfolders under our folders, so we can have a subfolder for, let's say, onboarding and another folder for offboarding. And we could then these to the appropriate folder as needed. So here, if we wanted to look at all of our HR processes, instead of looking through our entire list of all of our published workflows, we're able to quickly and easily find those organized nicely into folders. Next, back in our workflow administration console, let's take a look at some of our workflow security and permissions that we have available. If we go under our Permissions and Rights tab in the Workflow Admin Console, we can see all of our workflow users that are added in. Workflow is going to use Active Directory users or Active Directory permissions to determine who's allowed and who's not allowed to use workflow. So here, by default, workflow is going to add in the everyone group as an administrator. The first step to securing your system will be to limit down everyone's permissions to only the permissions everyone would need. So here, for example, I have all of our users. So all users are able to search workflows, and that's it. They're not able to create new workflows, delete workflows, modify settings. We're only allowed to search. Our administrators group, here we have administrators having all permissions. So administrators can do everything. Our standard users are only able to search. If we select our specific user account, we can configure access rights to specific workflows, for example. So by default, everything will be not set, but if we use our imagination and say this as HR users, we could then find all of our HR workflows and set our rights to editor, viewer, or no access. So our HR users, I would assume, would have viewer access to our HR workflows, but nothing else. If we wanted all of our users by default to not have permissions to those workflows, we would leave those at not set. That way, our workflow permissions are going to inherit appropriately. So if someone is not allowed access to a workflow, granting them access elsewhere won't override that. I haven't seen workflow rights, access rights for specific items used very frequently at all. Typically, it would be for those very sensitive processes, very sensitive data sources. So for example, HR, we don't want any user with access to workflow to be able to interact with that HR data source. So we could restrict that specific data source to only our HR power users. Finally, under our system configuration, we'll take a look at our advanced server options. And this is where we're able to configure our search instance lifetime, reporting instance lifetime, what information is saved, and for how long. Under our maintenance tab in our dialog, we have the option to remove reporting data, remove instance data, and remove unreferenced items from our workflow message cache. I'm not quite sure what that last one does, but it's there. Removing our instance data for completed workflows, this is going to remove only the tracked information per that workflow instance. So for example, if I were to take a look at this completed workflow instance, under messages, we have tracked information here. We have tracked information for conditionals for all of our activities. This is the instance data that workflow would purge. The other option for reporting data, that's going to be the data that we see when we create our workflow statistics report, for example. So when we're reporting on multiple instances and we want to see total, average, minimum, maximum, that's our reporting data. There's a lot less data for reporting than there are for individual instances. So if your database is getting rather large, you can try limiting the lifetime for the completed instance information. However, that's going to limit how far back you can search for those workflow instances. The next option we'll look at is the workflow tab. And this tab is absolutely delightful. Within this tab, we have the ability to control really what's tracked per workflow instance, almost based on the name of the tab here. So if we have a lot of tracked token activities and we don't want to go through all of our workflows to remove all of those, we can uncheck our token option for default, and that will stop tracking tokens in the instance log for all of our workflows. A little bit of a dangerous option there. So a better choice would be to kind of pick and choose which workflows. So if our HR employee warning, oh, that's not a happy choice for a workflow that runs a lot. Happier choice, HR employee auto file. So if this workflow runs often and we're tracking a lot of tokens, we have a lot of conditions, we're getting a lot of bloat in our workflow database, we can turn off these specific options for that specific workflow. Other options under log files, we can choose to delete old log files. So this is going to be more on the workflow server rather than the workflow database, where it will store error logs, activity logs. If we are getting a lot of log files on our server, we can have workflow automatically purge those every, in this case, 24 hours after a lifetime of 7 days. That concludes the live demonstration portion of today's webinar. If you do have questions or would like additional information, we have resources available at answers.laserfiche.com, the Laserfiche Solutions Exchange, the Laserfiche Support site, and the CDI YouTube channel. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you do have more questions or specific questions. You can contact us at consulting, sales, or support at citiesdigital.com. And thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Michael Mathis. I am the Solutions Director here at CDI. And at this point, I will stay on the line for any additional questions that may come up. If you do have questions, please post them into the questions box. One question I see is, can workflows be in multiple folders in the case of cross-functional workflows? Yes, they can. Yes, they can. That's one of my favorite features there. So if we created another folder, we'll just call it miscellaneous, and we'll abbreviate it because I don't really know how to spell miscellaneous on a live webinar. So here we'll add in just a couple miscellaneous workflows, and let's add in our HR time off request. So we now have that time off request workflow in both our HR processes folder and our miscellaneous folder. We have a question, is there a report that you can run that shows the last date each workflow was run? That is a good question. I am not sure off the top of my head, but let's take a look. So here we can see all of our processes. If we view our chart for instances started over time, it's not the best view. That is something that I will look into further and get back to you on. We do still have time available in our webinar for any additional questions. If you do have any questions, please post those into the questions box. Right, I don't see any additional questions coming in at this point. If you do come up with any other questions, I know I always think of my questions right after the webinar. Please don't hesitate to reach out to your account manager or to consulting, sales, or support.